I would like to welcome Alex Brandell to our Lane Lyceum tonight. He's coming all the way from Minnesota, and it's wonderful. That's one of the joys of Zoom, is that we can have speakers from various places, and so it's wonderful to have you join us from there. And I would like to just welcome everyone there. We've got, looks like, some new people, and it's always great to have new people join us. Lane Lyceums are a forum for, it's something we've been doing for many, many years, and it's really a place to have just a wide variety of talks and people sharing their expertise and ideas. And so it's wonderful to have Alex join us tonight and continue that. You know, they're named after our own dear Ed Lane, who was a member of our church for many years and really valued the sharing of ideas and learning new things, learning important things. And this talk tonight is certainly fits that bill. That we're really pleased to have Alex with us. Couple business things. If you are new and would like to be on our mailing list, please send me in the chat your email address, and I will add you to our. We send out a blurb, usually the day before. So please feel free to let us know that you'd like to be on the mailing list. And also, once we get started, we would ask that everybody mute themselves. So we would appreciate that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie Ross-Degnan, who is going to introduce Alex and our topic tonight. Okay, great.
Great. Hi, everyone. Nice to see so many people joining us this evening. As Amy said, we're really happy to have Alex join us with us tonight for this very timely presentation on gender diversity and pronouns, and also some of the issues facing the transgender community today. A little bit about Alex. I'm not going to tell too much because I think he wants to join in. We're happy to have him. He's an occupational therapist and a transgender health educator, and they completed their OT doctorate at BU with a focus on issues of healthcare and access for the trans community. Alex has presented on diversity education at the American Occupational Therapy Association conference, and they also led workshops with health professionals, university faculty, and the general public. We were just speaking with Alex, and they mentioned that they've been doing this now for a few years and been very busy. I'm sure many of you are aware that aware that anti-trans legislation is growing in America. States are banning books in schools and libraries that promote gender fluidity and the use of gender pronouns. States are passing bathroom bills prohibiting students to enter a restroom that doesn't align with their sex-assigned birth. And then, of course, there's Florida and their transgender healthcare ban. So yes, this is a timely presentation, and we appreciate your being here with us this evening, Alex. I'm sure there will be lots of questions, and if you can, please put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. But if other questions occur to you as we're discussing and you don't get it in the chat, just raise your hand or use that little icon to raise your hand, and we'll do the best we can to get to you. And now I'm happy to hand this over to Alex.
Hello, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to Lane Lyceum for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk with you all, especially given, as was mentioned, the timeliness of this conversation. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to get to speak with you all today. As was said, a little bit about me. My name is Alex. I primarily use they, them pronouns, although I also use he, him pronouns. I'm an occupational therapist, so I have a background in healthcare, but my true specialization and interest is in transgender and gender diversity, health, and education. And as was said, I've been working in transgender health for 3 or 4 years now, and I'm doing these kind of educational speaking events for a couple of years as well. Some of my other identities that I bring to the space and that inform my perspective is that I am white, identify as non-binary, identify as queer in a sexual gender minority way, as well as a political identity and label. And I also identify as neurodivergent. Overall, if any of those things are unfamiliar to you, we're kind of be exploring some of this together here today. So hang on to that and we'll come back to it in a little bit. Just kind of an overview of our conversation today. We're going to start out with some general concepts and terminology so that we can all have a shared language when discussing some of this. We're also going to talk about pronouns, something people often have a lot of questions about. From there, we're going to go into why does this matter? Why are we here talking today? What's the importance of this? Just so you know, in that section, we're going to be talking about what might be some difficult topics for some people, including suicide, eating disorders, and transphobia. If you need to step away at that point or at any point during the presentation, please feel free to prioritize yourself and your own health and emotional well-being needs. From there, we're going to talk about ways that we can help and support the trans community. And then, as was said, we'll have some time at the end for questions, answers, discussions. Before we dive too deep into that, though, I also want to sort of turn it back to you. This is just some quiet reflections to sort of open up our thinking to some of these topics. You do not need to share this information aloud or in the chat, but we're going to take about a minute of quiet reflection to think about a few questions. The first one is, how do you know your gender, and when did you first become aware of it? What do you enjoy about being your gender, and are there gendered expectations that you do not enjoy? Finally, what messages were you given by society that inform your understanding of gender? All of these questions are really big questions. I don't expect that you're going to be able to get to all of them in a minute, but choose one that piques your interest, and we're just going to take about a minute of silent reflection time to think about this. All right, thank you everybody for taking that moment of reflection. I encourage you to kind of keep these questions in the back of your mind and come back to them either later in the presentation or after our presentation and see if any of your thoughts have maybe changed or if you're thinking about things in a different way. We're going to go ahead though and start talking about some of our concepts and terminology, and we're going to start with assigned sex. Someone's assigned sex at birth is the sex classification that a child is given when they are born. Basically, it's what the doctor says when the baby comes out and they say it's a boy or it's a girl, and then they write that on the birth certificate. Usually it's based upon an external anatomy that is seen, but a person's sex is actually a combination of characteristics, including chromosomes, hormones, internal and external reproductive organs, as well as secondary sex characteristics, which include things like breasts, facial hair, and other characteristics that we use to differentiate between sexes. Usually someone is either assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. Throughout our conversation today, we're going to be talking about best use language and terminology that are maybe outdated or that we want to avoid. When we're talking about the concept of assigned sex, we want to refer to it as assigned sex at birth or designated sex at birth. We don't want to use terms like biological sex or someone's real sex, right? Because that's implying that that assignment which was given onto you is something inherent into yourself that maybe is unchanging, such as in the example of biological sex or real sex. We also don't want to say that someone was born a man or born a woman, because again, that was a classification that was placed onto them without that person's consent or agreement that that reflects who they are. That's why we say assigned sex, because it's a categorization that was assigned onto you. Another sort of category of sex is intersex. And intersex describes individuals whose sex characteristics do not align with the quote unquote typical male or female. It can include differences in someone's anatomy, hormones, or chromosomes. And many people think when we're talking about this community of people that these are really, really rare occurrences, and we don't really need to worry about it that much because it's so rare. But the occurrence of intersex individuals is actually a lot more common than you might think. The occurrence is at about a 1 in 100 rate, which for something more tangible is about the same rate as the number of people with red hair. So if you think to yourself, how many people have I met, interacted with, or even just seen out in the world who have red hair? The reality is that you've known and met and seen a similar number of people who are intersex. You likely just did not realize that that was the case. Again, as a note on language, in the past, this has sometimes been referred to with words like hermaphrodite, but that term is very outdated and is no longer appropriate to be using for this population. Instead, we say intersex. Also of note, throughout the presentation, I've included some photos of people who represent the various communities that we're talking about today. If you have questions or interest in continuing with your journey of knowledge with any of these topics, they're all really great resources, and I highly recommend looking into them and their work. So gender identity is another term that's important to understand when talking about these topics. And someone's gender identity is their own internally felt sense of their own gender. It might match their assigned sex, or it might be different from their assigned sex. The most important thing to know is that someone's gender identity is not visible to other people. It is only something that that person can feel and identify within themselves. These two topics are important to understand because they help us understand what it means to be transgender. Transgender is an umbrella term which is used to describe individuals whose gender identity, that is that internal felt sense, is different from their assigned sex at birth. Often this will just be shortened to trans. Transgender as an umbrella includes transgender men, that is individuals who are assigned female at birth, whose gender identity is as a man. Transgender women who were assigned male at birth and whose gender identity is as a woman, and non-binary people, which we are going to talk about a little bit more in depth in a moment. Again, related to terminology, transgender is an adjective, and we can think of it as being used like every other adjective, just a descriptor for what type of a person someone might be. If you were trying to describe someone's height, you wouldn't say she is tall or he is a tall, right? You would say she is tall or he is a tall man. It's the same with transgender. It's an adjective used to describe someone, not a noun. So we want to say she is transgender or he is a transgender man instead of she is transgendered or he is a transgender. As I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be non-binary. Non-binary is also an umbrella term for a variety of identities that fall partially or wholly outside of the categories of man and woman. Sometimes this can be really hard to wrap your head around, especially if you've never questioned your own identity or never experienced that kind of non-binary ambiguity. So in order to help us understand this a little bit better, I'm going to use an analogy that I learned from another speaker named Corey Will. And that is to think of the question, how many colors are there? That question's a little bit hard to answer, right? There's a lot of variables that go into how we perceive and define color. We might look at the wheel here and say, okay, there are 12 colors, but where do we decide exactly where the colors begin and end? What happens if we zoom in to that color wheel a little bit? Now, all of a sudden, the answer to the number of colors that exist gets a lot more difficult. Where exactly does blue become green? Now let's bring in language and culture. In some cultures and languages, they don't differentiate between green and blue. They're considered the same color. So how many colors are there then? And in our language, we consider pink and red to be separate colors, but not necessarily light blue and dark blue, even though isn't pink just a light red? Why is that? It's because that's what we decided in our culture and our shared language. We could say that there are 12 colors. We could say that there are 1,000 colors, and neither one would be accurate because they would never be able to capture every color and the way every culture perceives those colors. We can use this as a way to think about gender. In our culture, we traditionally have 2 genders, man and woman. But what happens if we zoom in on that, just like we did on the color wheel? Does every man perceive being a man in the same way? Does every woman? And where exactly is the line? If we believe that gender identity is something that's felt inside ourselves and not based necessarily on our physical bodies, then where exactly is the separation between men and women? And like I said, in our culture, we traditionally have 2 genders, but in many, many other cultures across time and across the world, they have more. So what about those? Does green cease to exist if we don't call it green and we call it by the same word as blue? I know all of this is a little bit conceptual, but if we can expand our thinking just a little bit, we can realize that just like color, we can label gender in many different ways and never quite capture all of the different experiences and all of the cultural interpretations of those experiences. Non-binary people and trans people more broadly are a very diverse range of people with a diverse range of identities, expressions, experiences. Some people might use only one pronoun, they can use any pronoun, they might transition medically or not. And ultimately, it's just important to keep in mind that if you've met one trans person or one non-binary person, then you've only met that one person, and their personal experience is not necessarily reflective of the broader trans community. Continuing on with some of our terminology, we're also going to discuss what it means to be cisgender. Cisgender is a term used to describe someone whose gender identity, that internal felt sense, aligns with their assigned sex at birth. In Latin and as prefixes, trans means across and cis means on the same side as. So as with transgender, this is just a way of describing someone. A woman could be transgender or cisgender, both of them are women. These are just extra adjectives that we can use in order to help better understand and contextualize their experiences. As I said before, we don't want to use the words like real woman or real man, as that implies that transgender people are not legitimate or real within their gender identity. Instead, we use the word cisgender when we are talking about someone who is not transgender. We also are going to explore gender expression as a concept. And gender expression can be a little bit tricky because gender expression is a physical expression of gender, such as your name, your pronouns, your manner of dress, things like that. What gets tricky about it is that gender expression is not the same as gender identity. People can express their gender differently, even if they identify as a shared thing. So as an example, we might know people who are our same gender identity, but who express themselves very differently than we do. A person's gender identity might be as a woman, but they might feel more comfortable in their gender expression being more masculine, for example, wearing pants instead of dresses, cutting their hair short, choices like that. Because we know that gender expression is not the same as identity, it's also important to keep in mind, again, that we cannot look at someone and know what their gender identity might be. We might be able to make an educated guess based on their expression, but ultimately only that person is able to fully know and comprehend their own identity. A concept related to gender identity and assigned sex, but that is a sort of discrete and separate concept, is sexual orientation. Sexual orientation describes a person's physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction. It is, as I said, fully separate from gender identity. Transgender people can be any sexual orientation, just the same way as cisgender people can. transgender people's sexual orientation is also based upon their gender identity, not their assigned sex. So for example, if a transgender woman is interested in women, then she might identify as a lesbian or bisexual. If she is attracted to men, she might identify as straight. Attraction to transgender people is also based upon gender identity. So in the picture here, Jamie on the right is a transgender man, and his partner on the left, Shaba, is a cisgender that is not transgender woman. Therefore, they are in a heterosexual relationship, not a lesbian one, because it is based upon Jamie's identity as a man. I've just thrown a lot of terms at you and a lot of ideas at you, and this might be kind of spinning around your head and saying, how does this all come together? And one tool that we can use to try and bring all these concepts together is the gender unicorn. And the gender unicorn is a tool that's used in order to understand how all these terms combine in order to create one person's experience. Some things that I like about this model is that each piece is its own amount, as opposed to a spectrum where man is on one end and woman is on the other. This accounts for that people might feel multiple things, right? You might feel aligned with both man and woman, for example. I also like that it's a 0 to 100 scale. So, that gives you the option of being 0 as something, if that is how you feel that represents you. I also like how it's separated out the different categories in the way that we discussed: separation of gender identity and expression, as well as separation of physical and emotional attraction, which can be different for people as well. So again, in order to help us kind of understand how this would be used, I asked a friend of mine to fill out the gender unicorn, and we are going to go through their placements of themselves in order to sort of understand how all this comes together. If we start at the top, we can see that my friend identifies very low on the female woman girl spectrum and a lot higher on the male man boy spectrum, also fairly high in other genders as well. When we contrast that to their gender expression, however, we can see that those are not exactly the same thing, right? We see that their gender expression is maybe what we would call more androgynous, being sort of more to the middle of everything, although a little bit higher on masculine than the other two. So we can see that sort of differentiation between gender identity and expression. My friend was assigned female at birth, and we can again see the distinction between physical and emotional attraction, right? My friend feels fairly attracted to everyone physically pretty equally. But when it comes to emotional attraction, they find that they're much more interested in women than men, and with other genders, it's somewhere in the middle. So we're going to take another moment of kind of quiet reflection and thought. And again, you do not need to share this aloud or in the chat, but I want you to just kind of go down the gender unicorn and think to yourself, where would you place your own dot on these various categories? See what you think, and we're going to take about a minute again to think about that. All right, thank you again, everyone, for that moment of reflection and for taking the time to think about it. Maybe you're someone who was able to move through that really quickly and you said, yep, I know exactly where I am on all of those scales. And maybe you're someone who started to look at this and think, you know what, I'm actually not 100% sure where I would place myself. Regardless of which category you kind of fall into, I do recommend, like I said earlier, coming back to this after our presentation and thinking about it a little more and thinking about kind of why you placed yourself where you did or why you feel like you weren't sure about where to place yourself. We are going to move on, though, to a topic that, as I said earlier, people often have quite a few questions about. I'm going to try and give a lot of information here up front. And as a reminder, we will have questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat and we can return to them at that point. Pronouns are a set of words that a person wishes to be referred to as, often in order to reflect their gender identity. Some examples of really common pronouns are he, him, his, she, her, hers, and they, them, theirs. But there are also more pronouns beyond those three options. Neopronouns are some of those other options, and those are a set of pronouns that are not officially recognized within a language that do not specify a gender. So someone who didn't feel that their identity was reflected by maybe they, them pronouns or he, him, or she, her pronouns might choose to go with a neopronoun instead. Mai Kawabe, the author pictured here, uses am, ers pronouns. So if I was going to talk about M, I would say that I read their book and I thought A did a great job of describing their experiences. So they use, they're used in a sentence similar to the way that traditional kind of pronouns would be used. But they just take a little bit of practice. And if I had one piece of advice for all of you who might be struggling with pronoun usage, it would be practice, practice, practice. The more often that you practice using a pronoun that's unfamiliar to you, the easier that it will be to start using it when you mean to, and the more natural it will feel. You know, I'm no different than any of you. Whenever I first kind of was introduced to the trans community and to people who used they, them pronouns or neopronouns, it really felt like it kind of caught in my throat and I stumbled over it and I had a hard time figuring out, you know, when I should use different things. And one strategy that I tried that I think could be helpful to you as well would be to go and do some people watching. You know, as we've discussed earlier, you can't necessarily know someone's gender identity just by the way that they look. So go do some people watching and practice using a different pronoun. You can just use it in your own head. You don't have to, you know, say it to anyone. But if you go out and you say, you know what, I'm going to practice using they, them pronouns in my mind for everyone who I see today, and just being like, oh, I like their shirt. Oh, they're walking their dog, right? Just starting to use that mentally will help whenever you start trying to say things verbally. Another tip that I would have is being conscious to always refer to someone, a particular person who you know, by their chosen pronoun, even if it's just in your thoughts. I've met people before who are like, I want to be respectful of, you know, this person's pronouns, but it's just confusing for me. So, you know, I'll think, you know, using a different pronoun in my head, and then I'll verbally correct myself as I speak. And the reality is that once we get in the flow of conversation, it's going to slip out with the wrong thing, even if you don't mean for it to. So I recommend being really diligent about correcting yourself, not only when you say the wrong thing verbally, but whenever you think the wrong pronoun as well. If you do make a mistake, that is not the end of the world. Mistakes happen. It's okay. The best way to handle it in the moment, if you realize that you've made a mistake, is by quickly apologizing, correcting yourself, and then moving on. So if I use the wrong pronoun and I said, oh, she's going to run to the store. Sorry, I mean, they're going to run to the store and they're going to buy some snacks. What do you want? Right? I apologized, I quickly made the correction, and then I kept it going. What we don't want to do is enter a sort of profuse apology where I say, I'm so sorry, this is just really new to me and I'm just not used to it yet, but I'm trying really hard. So like, please don't be mad at me. Once you kind of build up that moment more and more, you're building up that discomfort, that anxiety, and the spotlight that you're putting on the mistake, which is really, really uncomfortable for the person who has been just harmed by the use of the wrong pronoun. It also puts that person in the position of needing to comfort you and say, it's okay, I know that you're trying, right? When that's the person who's been harmed by you. So it's important that you take the moment to take accountability, apologize, and don't put that other person in the position of needing to comfort you. It's okay to feel badly. I know we are all here coming from a good place and that we want to say the right thing and do the right thing. But the best way to handle it is, like I said, to just do a quick apology and then keep the conversation going. This chart, we don't have time to run through the entire thing more fully, but there, if you just search pronouns chart on Google, you can find something similar to this very easily. So if you're ever unsure of a new pronoun that you're learning, I recommend finding a chart like this so that you can help kind of understand which forms of the pronoun is used in different situations. As I said, we're going to come back to this with questions. We're also going to talk a little bit more about some pronoun stuff later. So we will keep moving into kind of our last terminology section and topic. But if you have more questions about pronouns, please feel free to either put them in the chat now or hold on to them to the end of the presentation, and we can discuss it further then. As I said, the last kind of category of terminology that we're going to talk about is transition. And transition is the process of changing yourself and various things about yourself from a gender that you don't identify with to one that you do. And there are a number of components to this. The first one is social transition, and social transition is often the first thing that someone will do. That can include going by a new name, going by different pronouns, maybe changing the way they dress or getting a new haircut. They're all things that are relatively easy for someone to do independently. The second category is what most people think of when we talk about transition, and that is medical transition. So that would be taking hormones, being on hormone therapy, as well as potentially exploring surgical procedures to alter someone's body to align their physical self more closely with their identity. The third category is legal transition, and that can come through a legal name change, or through a gender marker change. And for anyone who's unfamiliar, a gender marker is on any form of ID that you might have that has a little M or a little F to designate your sex. It is possible for trans people to have that changed. If you think about all of the situations in which you might present your identification, you might start to realize how important that can be for a person to have a marker that reflects what maybe someone else is assuming about them, right? If you think about when someone is maybe pulled over by a police officer or going through airport security, or even just trying to show their ID to get a drink, you know, it opens trans people up to a lot of risk for harassment if they hand over an ID that has an M when someone is expecting to see an F, right? One thing that's important to know about transition overall is that not all trans people will transition in any or all of these ways. Counter to the narrative that you might be familiar with, many trans people do not wish to medically transition or might choose to do only parts of medical transition, such as choosing to do hormone therapy, but not to get any surgeries. Those are all very common, and we should support trans people in finding whatever transition process that feels most affirming to them, and also reducing barriers to accessing some of those more difficult changes, such as access to medical care, access to changing your gender marker. So that was a lot of terminology. We just spent a bunch of time, about half an hour, talking about all these different terms and ideas. So why, right? Why does this matter? Why do we need to spend a little bit of our time learning about this? And this is where we're going to talk about some of those more difficult subjects. So again, if you ever need to step away, please feel free to do so. But if trans people are not supported, research shows us that they are at increased risk of suicide and suicidal ideation, that is thinking about suicide or considering suicide, higher risks of negative mental health outcomes, including depression, anxiety, substance abuse, a large range of things. Eating disorders is another common problem when you think about someone who is feeling really uncomfortable within their own body. I think it sort of makes sense that that is often a step that people go to, right? Is trying to control or change their body through disordered eating. We also see sort of more societal, socioeconomic impacts around homelessness, as well as employment discrimination. We don't have time to get into every single one of these today, but I am going to dive into a handful of them more in depth, just to give us a sense of the scope of some of these impacts. When it comes to mental health, in 2015, they did a really large survey of transgender people in the United States. It was of over 20,000 trans people. They just did the updated one, and I'm not sure when they're going to be releasing the results for that, but they do them about every 4 or 5 years. When they did it in 2015, 39% of trans adults reported facing serious psychological distress. And that is compared to only 5% of the general population who reports the same thing. So you can see that there is a huge disparity between those two numbers. 48% of respondents experienced suicidal ideation. Again, that's considering suicide in the past year, compared to only 4% of the general population. And 7% of trans people attempted suicide in the past year, compared to only 0.6% of the general population. So we can see that these are huge differences between the experiences of the general population of cisgender people compared to the trans community. When it comes to some of those socioeconomic factors, homelessness is also an enormously huge issue in the trans community. 1 in 3 trans adults have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives, with 1 in 8 having been homeless in the last year. Again, just hugely, staggeringly high rates of homelessness within that community. Even more concerning, or to add to the concern, 70% of people who stayed in shelter while they were homeless reported some form of discrimination or abuse, whether that was verbal harassment, physical assault, sexual assault, or in some cases being denied access to the shelter because of their trans identity. So not only are we seeing a staggeringly high rate of homelessness, we're also seeing an incredibly high rate of people who are being abused in the places that are supposed to help them, and that cause trans people to feel like they are not able to access the supports that are available to other people who are experiencing homelessness as well. As was mentioned earlier, now in our political climate is also a just hugely important time to be talking about some of these things. The current number as of earlier today, when I updated this slide, the current number of anti-LGBT bills being tracked by the American Civil Liberties Union is 427 bills nationwide. The last time that I gave this presentation was last week. And at that time, the number was 378. So that is almost 50 new bills in just 1 week. There are a lot of different types of bills being brought forward. I know that Leslie was good enough to already give us a little bit of a summary, so I don't want to be repetitive with what she's already shared. The main categories I would say that these bills are typically falling under. The first one is healthcare access, most often around banning gender-affirming care for minors, which I will, I'm happy to talk about that more with people if that's something you want to discuss, because I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about what gender-affirming care for minors looks like. Generally, it is not much of those medical transitions around hormones and surgeries. There's kind of other things that are done to support youth and minors who are experiencing a need for gender affirming care. Some of those bans on affirming care for minors are also now bleeding into adults. The state of Oklahoma recently forwarded a bill that would ban insurance from covering gender affirming care. So you can imagine that that would severely limit the number of people who are able to access that care if you're not able to use insurance, both for minors and adults. There are also states introducing legal repercussions for doctors, in some cases, including felonies, for providing gender-affirming care to their patients. The second category that I would say things fall under is restriction from public life. And basically all of those laws are aimed at removing trans people from the ability to live their lives as much as possible, forcing people into closets, into shadows, forcing people to choose between their ability to live a happy and fulfilling life and living as their fulfilled identity as a trans person, right? So some of the things that fall into these are sports bans. In, I believe it's Arkansas, I think, they are introducing legislation to make it illegal for a trans person to use the restroom at the same time as a minor is using the restroom. So if you imagine every time you go to a public bathroom, having to scope out who's in the stalls, because if there's a kid in there, you could get in trouble for just existing in that space. We see the ban of gender studies programs, restriction of employment by public employers, as well as drag performance bans. The drag performance performance bans, I think it's important to note that those are almost always written in a way that not only covers drag performers, who should also be protected as a form of artistic expression, as an important sort of cultural practice of the LGBT community. But those laws are also written in a way that trans people are sort of falling under the categorization of drag, because you are someone who is sort of presenting in a manner that is different from your assigned sex. Again, there was a bill, I believe it was again in Arkansas, that was introduced that was written in a way that if we were in Arkansas under that law, the presentation that I am giving to you right now would be illegal, because it would be categorized as an adult-oriented performance, the same as an adult film, for example. Because I am a trans person who's presenting in a way that's different than my assigned sex, and because the categorization of performance is so broad that it includes almost any kind of public event. Again, we also see the Don't Say Gay bills we've seen in Florida and some other places as restriction from public life as well. The final category, and one of the ones that I find most concerning, is what I'm kind of calling trans as abuse. And those are classifications of if a parent allows their child to receive gender affirming care, to pursue the care that they need because of their identity as a trans person, categorizing that action as abuse. So in that case, the state would be allowed to remove trans children from supportive homes by Child Protective Services, because they say that pursuing transition is abusive to that child. There's multiple states that are doing this. Texas and Florida are the ones that come to mind first, but they are certainly not the only ones. Florida has escalated that even further by saying that a child could be removed from the home by Child Protective Services if the child is allowed to transition, if they have a sibling who is transitioning, or if they have a parent who has transitioned. So again, if you are a trans person and you want to have a child, or you have a child in Florida, that person could be removed because it would be considered abusive for them to simply be in your presence as a trans person. Some of these laws also permit the seizure of children living outside of the state. So if you're a trans person in Florida and you're worried about this and you want to move somewhere else, you are not necessarily safe from these actions unless you move to a sanctuary city, which we will talk about more in a little bit. On top of this, we are seeing a lot of rhetoric in the media that is really polarizing, and that is really pushing this as a very serious issue, and one that I think people are overall not paying enough attention to. There has been, as you see on some of the headlines here, statements from neo-Nazi groups saying that this legislation has been great for their recruitment because it's really firing people up and getting people mad about, you know, the quote unquote woke left. And so it's increasing the recruitment into neo-Nazi groups. We are seeing legal experts say that some of the rhetoric coming out of the legislation we are seeing is genocidal in nature. And the, Holocaust Memorial Group, I forget, apologize what their full name is, has a 10 steps to genocide chart. And some experts are saying that we're at about step 7 out of 10 right now when it comes to trans people in our country. We're also seeing, violence and unrest at protest events and people being attacked. Just in Minneapolis recently, there was a trans woman who was beaten nearly to death in the city in an anti-trans attack. So there's a lot of really serious things happening nationally that's being driven by some of this anti-trans rhetoric. Just this month was the Conservative Political Action Conference, otherwise known as CPAC. For anyone who's not aware of that, that's a pretty mainstream conservative conference. It's been attended by people like Paul Ryan, Donald Trump, other politicians. And at that conference, a speaker there said that for the good of society, transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely, the whole preposterous ideology at every level. So this is not a subtext thing where trans people have to read into what's going on to understand what the goal is. They're being very clear and open about what the goal is. And as they say, it is the eradication of trans people from our society. So that was really heavy, right? That's a lot to deal with, and it's been really heavy for trans people. So what can we do to help, especially those of you in the audience who are cis people? Given how intense what we just talked about was, some of this at the beginning might feel minor, but we're going to kind of start small and we're going to work up into bigger things, starting at the personal level, working up to the national level. One really encouraging statistic that came out a couple years ago now was from the Trevor Project, which is an anti-suicide amongst LGBT youth advocacy group. And they did a study that found that having just one accepting adult can reduce the risk of suicide for an LGBT youth by 40%, which is a huge, huge reduction. And another encouraging thing that came from that study is that that accepting adult does not have to be a parent. It's great if it is a parent, that's fantastic. And I would love to see supportive and affirming parents, but it does not have to be one. It can be a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a teacher, a coach, a neighbor, a family friend, just anyone in that child's life who is affirming of them and who is accepting of them. So how can we be the accepting and supportive person in someone's life? We're going to start with some things that we should not do. We're going to talk about some things we should do. And then, like I said, we're also going to talk about some more national level things to support with some of the legislative actions that we're seeing right now. The first do not is do not ask unnecessary and invasive questions about their body or their life before transition. Unnecessary questions might include what their body looks like or what genitals they have. Some of you might be thinking, that seems obvious. Why would you ever ask someone that? Which I would say I agree, but it's actually very common for trans people to be asked those kinds of questions, even by strangers or loose acquaintances. Anytime you find yourself curious about someone, especially a trans person, I recommend asking yourself, like, do I really need to know this information in order to interact with this person? And am I asking this question of other people in my life, right? A random coworker or an acquaintance. Other information that's commonly asked about, but which you shouldn't ask for, is what their former name was, or asking to see a quote unquote before picture from before their transition. The second do not on our list is do not ask about their plans for any transition steps unless you are invited to discuss it. So for example, not asking them if they are getting or if they have had surgery, for example. If they initiate a conversation about transition with you or share that they're planning to take a step in their transition, the appropriate response is to support them, congratulate them if that's appropriate in the context, and then keep that information to yourself. Don't assume that just because it was shared with you, that that person is then comfortable sharing that information with other people as well. Lastly, do not use someone's former name, which is sometimes referred to in the trans community as a dead name, even if you are referring to something that happened before their transition. Once you know a person's chosen name, the only time that is acceptable to use their former name is if they have explicitly told you that they are not out or open about their identity to everyone in their lives, and that they do not want you to use that name in front of particular individuals. If you're ever unsure about that, you can always ask the person if they're comfortable with that name being used in all contexts or not. But assuming that they do want it used, we never want to use their old name, including things like, oh, you know, my friend John, who used to be Jen, right? There are ways to kind of address that without dead naming the person. On the personal level, things that are do's, things that I do recommend doing, sort of counter to the last one, do use someone's chosen name and pronouns, and try to be consistent about it, about always making sure that you are saying the right words. As we said, mistakes happen, whether from you or from someone else that you're around. And so another great do is to correct yourself and other people if a mistake is made. Again, with a brief apology, correction, and moving on, such as, you know, she went to the library. Sorry, I mean, they went to the library. Do not enter a profuse apology, just make the apology and move on. It's also really hard to speak up for yourself constantly. So having someone else to correct people on your behalf can be really, really helpful and really affirming. So if you're talking to someone and they use the wrong name for someone, saying, oh, I think you mean Sarah, or actually her name is Sarah, and correcting the other person when they make a mistake and say the wrong thing as well. Lastly, a person cannot correct other people or speak up for themselves when they are not even around. So if you hear something that is wrong, speak up. Correcting other people, speaking up when someone is making disparaging or ignorant comments about trans people. It's just really important to be someone's advocate and their ally, even if they are not around to see you take that action. If you feel really new to trans topics and the things that I just shared, these do's and don'ts, feel like they are not something you are currently able to do consistently, I recommend really focusing your efforts here and really making sure that you're sort of drilling in on pronouns, making sure that you're using the right language for the people around you in your immediate life. If you're someone who's like, yeah, I already got this, I feel pretty confident about my ability to use people's pronouns and to make corrections both to myself and other people, we're going to move on into some of the kind of more community level. Some of the things that can be really helpful to do at a community level is to be sure that you're providing gender neutral facilities at various public locations. That includes, gender neutral bathrooms, locker rooms. If you're not sure of where to go about some of these things, I recommend just asking at, your gym, your church, your kids' school, different things like that to find out what is going on in those spaces. Another thing that would be great to ask those spaces about is to review policies to increase inclusion and protection from discrimination, and making sure that it is explicit that trans people are protected in those spaces. Lastly, it can be really helpful to review organizational materials such as intake forms, data, maybe at your workplace or again at another establishment that you frequent. It can be really common for trans people to face bureaucratic barriers where, well, my legal name is one thing, but I want to be called the other thing. And instead, every single time I call my doctor's office, they ask me for my name and I have to give them my legal name, right? There's a lot of opportunities to increase inclusion for people informally through those kind of data points. If you are choosing to go down any of these roads with any of your organizations, I do recommend bringing in a trans person who has expertise in some of these changes in order to support you. Always, make sure that you're including the communities that you're talking about when making changes like this, rather than going on your assumptions of what that community might need or might want to see. Again, I think everyone can be involved at the sort of state and national level with some of this legislation that we are seeing. The top thing that you can do is just to stay informed. Like I said, I think that, there is news coverage of these things, and I don't think that most people kind of realize how extensive it is and how important it is to us as a country, even if you are not a part of the trans community. We are past a point of where trans people are able to fight the battle on our own. We really need our cis allies to step up and support us. So staying informed, keeping an eye on legislation, especially stuff that's happening within your own community, is really important. If you're able to, donations are also really important at this time, as the trans community is trying to push a lot of legal challenges of some of these laws that are coming into place. The Transformations Project, whose logo is here on the screen, is a great organization that helps keep track of these bills, inform people of these bills, and connect people with their legislators and provide action items to help fight some of this. The ACLU, like I mentioned before, is doing a lot of work on this. And you can also research local mutual aid and trans support resources to find things in your community. I also recommend finding legislation in your state and contacting your representatives. I know Massachusetts is not in the same place as Florida, for example, and there is still anti-trans legislation that's been introduced in Massachusetts. No state is immune from the legislation that's being enacted. And even beyond the anti-trans legislation, there's also pro-trans legislation. Minnesota currently is passing through the House a bill that would create us as a trans refuge state, so that if someone needs to flee their state for persecution from being trans because CPS is coming for their child, that we are a refuge for them and are a safe place that will protect them. So I recommend pushing pro-trans legislation as well as fighting anti-trans legislation. And then lastly, just making sure we're being intersectional. Bigotry is all connected. There's a reason why white supremacist groups are being inflated and their recruitment is being improved by anti-trans, anti-LGBT rhetoric. And that's because all bigotry is connected. We are all in community together and need to support each other. So make sure that you are also keeping an eye on issues facing other marginalized groups and making sure that you're supporting in that context as well. If you're interested in sort of learning more about some of these topics, I'm gonna quickly run through a couple of books, as well as a movie that I recommend checking out. I'll come back to this screen once we kind of enter into our question period for a minute in case you want to write down any of this. If you are sort of new again to this and you're still learning terminology and you feel like you need a little bit more support there, on the left, we have the ABCs of LGBT. That's a really great book that kind of talks through some of those basics. The two middle books, Sorted, Growing Up, Coming Out, and Finding My Place by Jackson Bird, and Redefining Realness, My Path to Womanhood, Identity, and So Much More by Janet Mock, are two memoirs by a trans man and trans woman, respectively. I both recommend them because they're well-written, good memoirs, as well as I think doing a really great job of tying their personal experiences into issues and the experiences of the trans community at large. If you're interested in exploring more about non-binary identities specifically, on the far right, Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Menon is a really great, really short read, which is about half about the author's experience as a non-binary person and about half about kind of common arguments, I guess, that are made against non-binary people and sort of rebuttals to some of those things. If you're not a book person and you are more of a movie person, there is a documentary on Netflix called Disclosure, which I highly, highly recommend. Consider it almost must-watch viewing for anyone who considers themselves to be an ally to trans people. Just know going into it, there is a lot of violence, sexual assault. There's adult-only content, language, imagery, so be mindful of who you are kind of watching that movie with. Make an informed decision before deciding to watch with your kids, perhaps. And also just know that there is a lot of transphobia discussed and shown in this movie. So if you are a trans person who is looking to watch this, make sure that you are in a safe emotional place and that you have supports to turn to in case it is really difficult for you to watch some of the things included in this documentary. However, I can't emphasize enough how important and meaningful this documentary is. So as I said, I'm going to go back for just a moment to the books in case anyone is wanting to write down any of the titles. And then as you look at that, we will open up to questions. And I am happy to talk about anything that came up or anything that's on your mind that we maybe didn't cover when it comes to some of these topics.
All right, let me just open the chat box here if I can. Doesn't seem to be opening up for me. Oh, here we go. Okay. There is one question about using two pronouns. I noticed that some trans people use he and they or she and they. So how do you sort that out? What's your advice about sorting that out? Or is it okay to switch while you're talking to them, go between?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm someone who uses multiple pronouns. And I think that every person who uses multiple pronouns has a different reason for doing so and might have a different preference. You're always welcome to ask an individual person, like, hey, what do you prefer that I do? Do you like it when it's switched up? Do you prefer one over the other? In general, on a large scale, I would say that, yes, it is advisable, I would say, to switch between pronouns. It doesn't have to be like every other sentence, but maybe just whichever one you kind of are going to use in the moment, sticking with it for that conversation, maybe switch it up for next time. The biggest thing is that if someone uses, like, let's say he and they pronouns, don't just default to one that you feel more comfortable with, right? Don't allow the fact that they use he pronouns as an excuse to not use the they pronoun. People notice whenever someone is doing that, and people notice whenever someone makes a point to incorporate the they pronoun into conversation as well. And it can be really meaningful and supportive whenever you identify that someone is comfortable enough with that pronoun to use it, even though there is an alternate option available. I would say that's especially true because some trans people, I can speak for myself when I say this, and I know I'm not alone in this, although not necessarily the universal experience. I use multiple pronouns because it's exhausting to constantly advocate for they, them pronouns. And so I say, you know what, they, them is my pronoun, but if you like are just not going to be able to handle that, then just do he, him. Like, I just don't have the energy for this. So, you know, being mindful of making sure you are using the full range of pronouns that's presented to you.
Yeah, thank you for that, because yeah, I think that's something important to be mindful of, that trans people have to deal with this constantly. Yeah.
Yeah. I will say, I think I've gotten a couple people messaging me directly, although it looks like maybe someone else added in the chat as well publicly about books. So books for elementary age children. I would say all of the books here, except for perhaps Janet Mock's book, which has some more adult themes in it, would be appropriate for younger readers. I can, if it would be of interest to people, sort of send more of a comprehensive list, because obviously it depends a lot upon the kid and their reading level and where they're at. The ABCs of LGBT, though, is a really great starting point, I think, for all ages. So if you're looking for something on this slide, I recommend going there. I'm not as well versed, I will admit, in like picture books or sort of early reader books, but I can definitely find resources to pass along if that's of interest to people.
Alex, I just wanted to say, I recently read a picture book called My Name is Jazz. Do you know it?
I have heard of that one, yes. I've heard it recommended in the past before. Did you find it good?
Yes, I thought it was very sensitive and developmentally appropriate for you know, teachers in the classroom that might have a child that is struggling and, you know, not sure. So it's very good. Okay, please comment on the term pregnant person.
Sure. You might have heard some of that language around inclusive language. Essentially, all that term is trying to get at is that trans men and non-binary people can and do become pregnant. There's a pretty, you know, not insignificant number of trans men who have been pregnant even after their transition and who give birth and are pregnant as fathers, right? So whenever sort of large scale communication is talking about, you know, oh, like this is our birthing center for mothers, or whenever, you know, you go into a birthing center and the form asks for, you know, mother, that's where some of that sort of recommendation for more inclusive language comes in, asking for, you know, the birthing parent and the other parent instead of asking for the mother and the father, for example. Some people bristle at that and feel like that's trying to erase someone's perhaps identity as a mother. And that's not the goal at all. Every trans person I know is totally comfortable with, you know, even that being kind of the primary part of what people are talking about. We're just sort of asking for a little bit of a broader lens when it comes to really large scale discussions, right? Saying like mothers and pregnant people, for example, like can be an example of, you know, supporting people who maybe do identify themselves strongly with the identity of being a mother, and being mindful that not everyone who isn't pregnant is going to identify in that way. If you have more specific questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it as well. But I would say that's sort of just an overview of where that term kind of comes from.
Okay. So another question is, why do we need to say she/her/hers and not just simply she or he or they? If they refers to a single person, does it use a singular verb?
Yeah, thank you for your question. There's a couple questions, I guess, there. The first one, why we say kind of she, her, hers, I usually just use the first two, I'll say she, her, or he, him, is partially just kind of language usage. We do plenty of things in our language that don't necessarily make logical sense, but that's just sort of the standard about how we say things. And sometimes that's just kind of how it is. I will also say that those ways of writing out pronouns can be really, really supportive for people who do use those neo-pronouns. So people who have, for example, pronouns that maybe aren't as commonly known, where you could just say she and people know what you mean, right? So having kind of a standard way of listing out all of the pronouns helps be inclusive to people whose pronouns are maybe less readily known. When it comes to they being used for a singular person, you can still use it in the traditional way. So if you were talking about someone who used they, them pronouns, you would say, oh, they are a student at the local university. You would still use it with the plural verb because that's sort of the syntax of how we typically use that word. But you would just know from the context that you're using it for a singular individual. Sometimes people have worries or, I don't know, thoughts about grammatical correctness when it comes to use of they, them pronouns. And I would say to anyone who's kind of thinking about that, I know this was not a part of your question, Leslie, but anyone who's thinking about that, just know that the singular they pronoun has been used for a very long time. I think the first use of it was in like the 1300s. You probably use it yourself constantly without realizing it. Being like, oh, I think someone dropped their wallet, right? You're using it for an individual person of an unspecified gender, and you're using it in the same context that you would if you knew that person did use they, them pronouns, right? We use that in a singular way all the time. It's just a matter of expanding your idea of when it can be used in that way. The final thing about that I would say is we all get to make a decision about whether we care more about grammatical correctness and grammar rules, or whether we care more about being kind and respectful of other people. Personally, I choose to be kind and respectful to other people, even if I don't fully understand or even necessarily agree with the experiences that they're presenting to me. But I personally don't feel that even if it was grammatically incorrect, that it would be worth the harm that it does to trans people to say that like you're not going to respect them in that way. And I know that, again, Melissa, I want to make sure that you know that I am not saying that that's what you are saying. I just wanted to kind of cover that sort of within the question of the they, them pronoun usage. So that is a question that comes up quite a bit.
Great, thank you. Someone put a link in the chat for a book called the Crayon, the Red Crayon.
Great, I haven't heard of that one, but I'm sure it's great. Yes, I'm a little less familiar with some of the more youth-oriented literature.
It said it's a book to start introducing the concept of gender diversity to very young kids. So there's a link in there if you want to take a look at it.
Yeah, I'll take a look.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I would like to, I'm gonna jump in. Alex, at what age do kids begin to think about their sexuality, their how comfortable they are with their gender?
That's a great question. It can vary. Sort of psychologically, kids first start being aware of gender as, like consciously aware of gender as a concept, and self-categorizing themselves into groupings around gender as early as 4 or 5. There are plenty of trans people who, as soon as that kind of starts happening, they start realizing that I am being categorized not in the group that I feel I should be categorized in. So that's a very common experience. People who have that experience kind of fall into that narrative of like, I've always known that I was born in the wrong body. You might have heard those kinds of narratives. But that is not necessarily reflective of all or even the majority of trans people's experience. A lot of trans people don't really start to acutely feel that incongruence until the onset of puberty, when, prior to then, maybe boys and girls, there's differences, but you can kind of be a tomboy or, get away with being in the group that you're quote unquote not supposed to be in. But that puberty then hits, your body starts changing in ways that you are very much not comfortable with. And the importance on sort of separation socially in, middle school and high school starts becoming more acute as well. So that can be a really common time for people to first start having those experiences. And the force of transphobia in our society is enormous. It's impossible to, summarize what it is, what it means. I know definitely whenever I was a younger person, I didn't even have any awareness that trans people existed. And even once I did, I like didn't fully get it for a long time. And it wasn't until, for me, my early 20s that I really started to be like, wait a minute, I'm learning about these people and these experiences, and that feels like what I feel. And even though I was maybe sort of loosely aware of the term LGBT and kind of knew what the T meant, I like didn't really understand it, right? So I would say the youngest that people might start experiencing that is as early as 4 or 5 years old, but some people don't realize until they're well into adulthood, just because of the lack of information and sort of the social pressures to not explore that part of yourself and your identity.
Yep.
Any other questions?
I'm good. You know, what's going to happen in these states like Texas and Florida, but many other states? What's going to happen to these people who are not able to live their life in an honest way?
That's a great question. And if I knew the answer to that, I think we could save everyone a lot of trouble when it comes to some of this legislation. I would say, I mean, there's, I guess, two paths. There's the like personal path of what is going to be the changes to individual people's experience and what's going to be like the legislative path, right? Presumably the ACLU and other groups will challenge a lot of these laws in courts. In the past, I would have said that they'll be dismissed once they get to courts because they are fairly obviously unconstitutional. And we also know that there has been work happening for decades by politicians to stack the courts in ways that are going to support legislation such as this, legislation such as, or not legislation, but decisions such as the repeal of Roe v. Wade, which we were talking about earlier before the presentation. So we know that the courts have been aligned in ways that are going to potentially allow this to continue moving forward. On a personal note, I guess the answer is that there will be people who have the ability and the privilege necessary to move. No one should have to leave their home because of persecution. And eventually that might become the only outcome. I hear from people fairly regularly at this point saying, hey, I'm from Tennessee and my husband is trans and like, we don't know what to do. Like, is Minnesota a safe place to move? And the answer, luckily for me, is yes. I don't have to at this point worry about moving. But there are other people who are making that decision, especially people whose children are trans and who, are very much in fear of those children being seized by Child Protective Services. We also know that I threw up some of those mental health rates before. A lot of those were, related to things in the past year. There have been studies in the past saying that 40% of trans people have attempted suicide at some point in their lives. So maybe not within the past year, which would be why those numbers that we saw earlier were lower than that total number, but 40% at some point. And what drives people to that, right? It's feeling trapped. It's feeling like they don't have options. It's feeling like there's no hope for a future for them. And so the people who are not able to leave the state, whether that's because they don't have the financial means, whether that's because they are a young person and they're not able to do that independently, I think that we're going to see higher rates of suicide in those states. And I think we'll see a lot of people who sort of repress themselves and stay closeted because they're not able to seek care. And it's better in their eyes to sort of repress that part of themselves than to be open and not be able to like access the care that they need. So not good outcomes, certainly. And I'm really hopeful that we can push back against a lot of this legislation and not have it get to that dire of a place.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit more about, on that same note, reasons for homelessness among trans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's sort of a range of reasons. When it comes to youth homelessness, I believe it's like over a third of homeless youth identify as LGBT plus one of those identities. So, you know, when you think about the reliance that young people have on their home environment, if a child either comes out and their family aren't supportive, or if that child is outed to their families, some of the legislation that we see happening is going to require employees of the state, such as teachers and things like that, to inform a parent if their child, they hear even a rumor that their child is identifying as trans amongst their friends or whatever, that they would be required to share with the parent. And that is an outcome that can come whenever someone is forced into sharing that part of themselves with their parent, and they're not from a supportive home. So that's part of it. Part of it ties to employment discrimination. It is incredibly common for trans people to be openly discriminated against in the workplace, to leave their job because they fear or they suspect that once they come out, there will be discrimination. And at the end of the day, that means that a lot of, trans people are funneled into the Black economy, right, of sex work, selling drugs, things like that, in order to make money, earn an income for themselves. And a lot of those professions, while not inherently wrong, you know, I certainly don't want to contribute to stigmatization of sex workers or anything like that, they're also riskier sort of professions to be in, and do come with, along with housing insecurity a lot of the time. So it's sort of a variety of factors that combine into making trans people, especially trans people of color, especially Black trans women, in that kind of vulnerable place in terms of socioeconomic success.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I don't know if there are any more questions, but any more questions? Just unmute yourself and ask. Oh, go ahead, Becky.
I don't quite know. This is not really a question, but I feel I'm sort of where we are headed politically. The fact that the right is able to make such a target out of this whole issue, and that it actually could potentially determine the result of the next presidential election, is just terrifying to me.
Me as well.
It just hits me in the gut. So I don't know if we could maybe talk about that level. I mean, there's so much here. There's so much here, but at the personal level, all the way up to the national level.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate, of course, your concern, and I appreciate everyone here's concern and sort of that motivation to know more and to explore the topic more. We certainly, like I said, need the help of our allies in this moment. It does feel in some ways bizarre, right, that such a small minority of the population would be kind of put in the spotlight in this way. And I almost included this in the presentation itself, and I almost wish that I had now. And this is historically what we know happens. I almost included and sorry, I guess content warnings for talking about, you know, the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, for anyone in this space who might hold identities for which that's a difficult topic to broach. In the early days of the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany, there was a lot of crackdown on a various range of minority groups, obviously Jewish people being at the forefront of that. But if we think of, you know, I think book bannings came up earlier. If you think of like the iconic photos in your head of like Nazi book burnings, I'm sure we can all kind of close our eyes and like picture those photos that we've seen in textbooks and documentaries and all of that. Something that you might not know, that a majority of those really iconic photos are from the raid and destruction of the Institute for Sexual Sciences in Berlin, which was doing some of that really early pioneering work around LGBT health, LGBTI identities, providing early gender affirming care to those groups. So at the same time as it does feel strange that such a small group is receiving so much ire. We also historically know that that's an early in point for those types of groups and has been historically throughout fascist movements, which is part of the reason why trans communities are trying really hard to like ring the alarm bell and say, like, we need to pay attention to this and stop this now, because we know historically that this can escalate in ways that maybe people who are not trans don't anticipate that it will, or that it's related. And that's another reason why, you know, I said in my resources that it's so important for us to be intersectional and to be thinking about all marginalized communities and how all of these issues are interconnected and how hate against one group promotes hate against another.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I feel like we're really struggling to get that to get that message across. I mean, there is so much hate, and the hate is being validated all the time. I just
I mean, I wish I had the solution to the problem, obviously, to present to you.
Yeah,
but
I really do. And I didn't know that about the book burnings. And it's amazing that we're talking about, anyway, the whole thing. There are so many.
Yes, it's a lot to grapple with, definitely. And I appreciate everyone here taking the time to grapple with it.
Your presentation was really excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Alex. And it was incredibly informative and very deeply appreciated by lots of people who are writing in the chat. So if there are no questions, Amy, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay. Well, I so appreciate, you know, so many people who came to this presentation, and especially to you, Alex, for being here and sharing, you know, just amazing insight that, you know, I think we're all grappling with it and trying to figure out how we can, you know, on a personal level, be as respectful as we possibly can. But then reading the news on the national level becomes overwhelming, as you said, Becky. And so we'll just keep working at it. But thank you so much for coming tonight.